Thank you very much, and good morning, of course, in Asia, good afternoon and good evening for whoever is participating from other parts of the world. It is great to see that large of a number of participants, given the circumstances that we are living in these days. So I should say welcome to my home. I don't think I've had that many visitors at my home, in a long time, and certainly not from so many countries of the world. Obviously, we're all participating from home in DC. So I'm very happy to be here and moderate this session. So my name is Alma Kanani. I'm the practice manager for public sector and financial management in the East Asia region, and I'm also the co-chair of the steering committee of the PEMNA network, and very happy to be here, as I said, moderating this webinar. We will be discussing today, as you know, about fiscal policy in the East Asian Pacific countries in the times of COVID-19, a very pertinent topic. As you know, as we all know, the recent events, obviously, and the spread of the COVID-19 has created not only a health emergency for our countries, but also an unprecedented economic crisis that has sparked a significant response and providing relief to households, to firms, and the need to deal with financial sector vulnerabilities. So at the same time, of course, governments at all levels, local governments, federal governments, have been very much under stress and trying to manage and address the crisis, with civil servants working from home due to social distancing. So that adds to the complexity of what the public sector needs to deal with during these days. Obviously, an important element of that relief has been the response on the fiscal side, which is what we would like to focus more today. And governments throughout the world have made available, as you know, a large amount of resources, including in the East Asian countries, fiscal packages that include tax relief measures, expenditure allocations, facilitation of payments and transactions, simplification of procurement processes, all of that as part of those fiscal packages. So hopefully we will be talking about some of these issues today. And we are very grateful to our colleagues from the Indonesia government, Pak Kunta, South Korea, Mr. Han, and Vietnam, Mr. Tan, who have taken time out of their very busy schedules to share their experiences with us. And of course, we will also be hearing from our colleagues from Philippines, Myanmar, and Thailand briefly during the agenda. So without actually further ado, just to say that we have planned for about 2.5 hours for this event. And before I go to the welcoming remarks from Mr. Han and Pak Kunta, I wanted to just say a few sort of ground rules for operating. Given that we are operating online, I think it will be important for all of us, first of all, to mute our microphones and perhaps try to also, when possible, maybe remove the camera signals in order to switch off the camera so that maybe the signals and the volumes we can be heard, and the speed probably can be more accommodating. We will try to have questions at the end of each session. The time is very tight, so I will try to intervene. So I apologize in advance if I'm going to intervene in the middle of speeches in order to manage the time a little bit. We will try to do this in one way or another, either through text messaging or through interventions during the speeches. So I would very much appreciate if everybody tries to maintain the time. And then at the end of the sessions, of each session of speakers, we will try to take questions. There is a raise your hand feature in the web through WebEx that we can use, or anybody who, I see that for our colleagues in South Korea, they are in the room. I can see you, so you can raise your hand and if you want to ask a question and then put your question forward. So let me stop here, and without further ado, it is a great pleasure to welcome Mr. Han, who is the PEMNA Steering Committee Co-Chair and Director General for Fiscal Performance Management in the Ministry of Economy and Finance of Korea, to make a few opening remarks. And then followed by Pak Kunta, who is the PEMNA BCoP Chair, Budget Community of Practice Chair, and Assistant to the Minister of for Government Expenditure Affairs for the Ministry of Finance of Indonesia. So, Mr. Han, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alma, thank you, Alma, for your opening remarks. PEMNA colleagues, I'm Kyung-ho Han, co-chair of PEMNA Steering Committee from Korea. I'm very pleased to see you all, and I appreciate that all the member countries agreed to this virtual conference under this challenging circumstance caused by COVID-19. The COVID-19 is threatening not only our health, but also our economy. IMF and OECD released pessimistic prediction on global growth rate due to COVID-19 impact. We are concentrating policy efforts on medical perspective. At the same time, in order to quickly bring our economy back to normal, we tried to take preemptive fiscal policy actions as well. As such, it is crucial to discuss and share each other's knowledge and experience in timely manner. The difficulties we are currently facing is unprecedented, and there lies a dilemma between strict quarantine policy and preventing consumption shrink. Global cooperation to bring up a creative solution will be necessary. Korea is undertaking comprehensive and preemptive fiscal support to help citizens, enterprises, and employers, which would complement this decreased consumption. Details on the Korean government's fiscal efforts will be elaborated in the presentation by my colleague, and I hope that all the participants could have a valuable opportunity to share their ideas during this meeting. I have confidence that today's conference will help us learn valuable lessons from each other and get policy ideas that could be implemented right away. I hope that member countries will overcome COVID-19 successfully as soon as possible, so that we can return to normal lives and meet with each other face to face in the next PEMNA meeting. Thank you.
Pak Kunta, over to you.
Thank you, Alma and Mr. Han. I'm Kunta, BCoP Chair. Good morning for everybody, for distinguished representative of Secretariat of PEMNA, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the European Union, and the PEMNA Communities of Practice and Budget, and the PEMNA Communities of Practice and Initiative. So first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the PEMNA BCoP members and various stakeholders who's making the first PEMNA BCoP webinar possible. So this is our first time we have the webinar. Extend my appreciation to the PEMNA Secretariat for its full support and cooperation, as well as for organizing the important webinar. PEMNA planned to hold the first 2020 PEMNA BCoP meeting in Dili, Timor-Leste on February 4 to 6, if you remember, but had to be cancelled due to the 2019 coronavirus disease pandemic, or we also called COVID-19. So like Mr. Han said, that COVID-19 has become the toughest challenge for the development of social, economic, and world welfare nowadays. In a relatively short period of time, this virus has drastically changed the direction of global development from optimism that economic recovery is believed to occur in the early 2020, becoming an inevitable threat of health crisis and then economic recession today. It is clear that the rapid spread of COVID-19 cannot be matched by the availability of health facilities and medical personnel in all of the countries, so that it can lead to a health crisis. On 28 April 2020, the total number of COVID-19 cases in the world has reached more than 3 million cases spread in 210 countries or territories, with the number of deaths due to the COVID-19 reached 211,000, or fatality rate of around 6.9%. When the COVID-19 pandemic will end, still be filled with uncertainty. All countries continue to increase the step of suppressing the spread of COVID-19 through tests, tracing, and distancing, like we are doing now with the webinar. So we need to think of the new norm of our life. The COVID-19 outbreak, which spread rapidly and threatened the health and safety of the people, has pushed countries in the world to take extreme and extraordinary preemptive measures. The pressure faced by the global economy due to COVID-19 is at a very high magnitude of the worst since the global financial crisis in 2008 or 2009. Disruption occurs in economic activities in both real and financial sectors, with hit individual or consumer to companies throughout developed and developing countries. Like in Indonesia, we heard a lot because most of our industry in informal sector. In the short period of time since the COVID-19 broke out, manufacturing and service activity in various countries contracted, unemployment soared, and contraction in economic growth also threatened many countries. The existence of this pandemic makes the global economy in the shadow of recession. In the real sector, pressures occur both on the demand and supply side, which in turn will suppress economic growth. The decline in the economic activity creates a decrease in public income to the threat of termination and employment, which in turn has implications for consumption. Production activities are also hampered as disruption in the supply chain and distribution, as well as failing investment. Several sectors are directly affected by this incident, such as the transportation, trade, and tourism sectors. The informal sector is also expected to be significantly affected by the economic disruption caused by COVID-19. In the financial sector, volatility is increasing very high, even exceeding some previous crises. This is influenced by investor concerns about the spread of COVID-19 and its profound impact on the global economy. As a result, the performance of the global financial sector has depressed quite deeply. High uncertainty in the global economy has disrupted confidence in financial market. The projected deterioration in the global economy has led many countries to take extraordinary policy measures to mitigate and overcome the socio-economic impacts of the pandemic. So this is moved from the health crisis to the economic crisis then to the financial crisis and then to global recession, I think. Various countries in the world have taken extraordinary policies by releasing enormous economic stimulus via both fiscal and monetary instruments, such as US, Australia, and Singapore announced the stimulus package around 10% of GDP. Can I continue?
Yes, please. Can people mute? I think somebody needs to mute the microphone, please.
So thank you. I continue. There are a very huge amount of economic stimulus. The policies that were carried out with the main objective of accelerating the handling of COVID-19 to mitigate economic and financial impact. Broadly speaking, fiscal stimulus allocated by countries provide a focus on increasing the head budget in order to accelerate the handling of COVID-19. In addition, assistance to communities and households is also generally provided by the government in various forms, such as cash assistance and social security. For business sectors affected by COVID-19, among others, assistance schemes such as tax reduction and deferred installment for small medium enterprises are provided. In dealing with the impact of COVID-19, fiscal policy is one of the government's main measures so that the economy can recover soon, like a V-shape. Through this webinar that are focuses on the topic of Asia-Pacific region fiscal response to the COVID-19 crisis, we can exchange experiences and knowledge to confer and address budget management challenges we are facing today and ahead due to COVID-19. As a peer learning forum of budget management practitioners, through this forum, we hope to be able to learn from multiple countries' experiences in deal with this pandemic, delivered by BCoP fellow members, experts, and development partners. It is expected that by sharing our thoughts today, we can conclude with fresh ideas on policy options to battling COVID-19 and accelerating economic recovery. The next webinar, maybe we can share the world after the COVID-19. What happened next? It's the new norm, or many issues will be raised in the future. Finally, I would like to extend my warm welcome to all of you, the PCoP and the TCoP members and the Secretariat. We hope this webinar will result in rewarding discussion for better improvements and that this will be an enriching experience for all participants. Maybe this type of webinar become our new norm. I am grateful for the opportunity to speak to you today and to be part of this important forum. Thank you. And I come back to Alma.
Thank you very much, Fakulta, for this very comprehensive summary of how the crisis has affected all aspects of life, and indeed it is an unprecedented situation in the world. So to give us a presentation about some of those issues that you mentioned in the context of the East Asia Pacific, we have invited the lead economist in our Malaysia country office to give us a presentation about the East Asia Pacific in the times of COVID-19. Over to you, Richard.
Great, thank you very much, Alma, and good morning to everyone across the region. As Alma mentioned, I'm based in our office here in Malaysia, so I'm connecting from Kuala Lumpur. And I have a short presentation which I'm hopefully going to share on my screen now, based on the report that we just released a few weeks ago, titled East Asia Pacific in the Time of COVID-19. I see there's several friends from Malaysia Ministry of Finance connected, as well as some old friends from Ministry of Finance in Laos. I used to work in Laos a few years back as well. So let me try and share the presentation now so that you can all see. And it should be coming now up on your screen.
Yeah, we can see it.
Great, right. So I'm going to present a few slides highlighting some of the key messages that we had in this report, and including a particular emphasis on the fiscal response to the crisis that we've seen countries both in advanced economies as well as emerging market and developing economies in this region undertaken. It is a summary presentation, but there's a lot more material on our website and in the full report, and I'll share the links to those at the end. And perhaps I should preface right at the beginning that a lot of essentially, as all of us who are economists right now know, as soon as we make any kind of projection or generate any kind of table or chart or piece of analysis, events are changing so quickly on the ground that often economic developments change very quickly and those numbers become stale. So I would sort of ask for your indulgence that some of the numbers may reflect our views from perhaps a couple of weeks ago, and of course you may have even more recent information and data in your particular countries. But briefly, hopefully I can talk a little bit about the evolving COVID-19 pandemic and how it is having the economic implications of the pandemic, both in advanced economies as well as in our region. A little bit how governments are responding, particularly in terms of fiscal policy, and then a little bit. And hopefully this will provide a useful starting point for some of the country discussions and presentations, which I think are going to take place after this. There's a little bit of noise as well. I could ask anyone to mute. Thank you.
I think there is, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I think that's clear. So perhaps starting off from the beginning, of course, if you rewind back to January, which I think frankly feels like a different world to what we're living in now, but back in January we were really thinking about this crisis as being a shock that was coming predominantly from China and was affecting the economies of this region primarily through trade and through global value chains. So many of the firms in the countries of the region that were closely integrated with global value chains that linked through China were experiencing disruption in the supply of critical components and inputs, as well as final demand. And we were seeing a shock that was coming through tourism as well. Of course, that quickly evolved, and we've now seen what simultaneous supply and demand shock around the world, which has now caused a global shock. We see the economies of East Asia and Pacific that were frankly already seeing slowing growth in 2019 and 20, resulting from successive years of trade tensions between the US and China. Of course, back in January, we were a little bit hopeful from a partial recovery from the phase 1 trade deal, but of course that feels like ancient history now. So we've seen regional economies that were seeing a number of factors that were slowing growth, now struggling with a viral disease and the context of a global shock and a major global recession. In fact, we suspect from the World Bank side, this will be the most significant global recession we've seen since World War II. So what does it mean? Well, the challenge I think that we all face is that while this region has had a lot of experience with responding to external shocks, particularly in the global financial crisis 10 years ago, and then the Asian financial crisis 20 years ago, this time it's a little bit different because we have a simultaneous supply and demand shock at the same time. And of course, that's preventing high density economic production and consumption, which has characterized a lot of the rapid growth that we've seen across the East Asian region in the last 20 years. And because there's such a large amount of uncertainty, we've seen the crisis morph into a financial shock, and unusually we're seeing the shock which has affected all countries simultaneously. And so perhaps it's no surprise that we've seen a number of unorthodox policy responses and measures to try to respond to the crisis. So what does it mean in macroeconomic terms? Well, of course, the demand shock means that we're seeing a decline in consumption and investment. This is, of course, a mixture of both the necessary mitigation measures, as well as tightening conditions, uncertainty, and declining confidence. Interestingly, we're also seeing a shock at the same time in supply, and this is something that's, in economic terms, quite unusual. Frankly, we're used to experiencing and knowing how to respond to a demand shock. These have happened, in repeated instances over the last 20, 30 years in response to external events, but a supply shock is a little bit different. And again, we're seeing declines in production as a result of deliberate policy choices in countries to respond to the pandemic, as well affected by supply chain disruption and tightening financial conditions. And of course, as a region which is closely integrated both within the region and with other parts of the world, we're seeing a number of channels where these shocks are being transmitted from one country to another. Obviously, trade is the most obvious one, and that's not just trade in goods and services, but also, not just trade in physical goods, but also trade in services, both through tourism as well as movement in natural persons. Financial markets are transmitting shocks from one country to another, and of course, commodity markets. And commodity market volatility is affecting countries in our region differently. Of course, some countries are commodity exporters, and so with weaker prices are seeing tons of trade decline from that perspective. Other countries in our region are commodity importers, and so to some extent are benefiting in terms of trade terms as a result of lower energy prices. And of course, all of these factors are having a significant impact, not just, of course, on economic growth, but on the behavior and viability of firms and households, conditioned on countries' policy responses. So what are we seeing at the global level? Well, this is something I'm sure all of you as well are monitoring on a high frequency basis as often as you can. But unsurprisingly, we're seeing a sharp contraction in global economic activity in response to the crisis, and perhaps more so in response to the policy measures that have been taken to try and control the pandemic. Very severe and rapid declines in indices of manufacturing and services, as well as global trade. And I'm sure many of you have seen these type of numbers mirrored in your high frequency data at the country level as well. Similarly, we've seen sharply tightened global financial conditions. The indices that we certainly track and monitor show very sharp increases in those measurements. We're seeing large outflows from emerging market and developing economies, and widening of spreads. Thirdly, of course, commodity prices have seen extreme volatility. Perhaps what's interesting is that a lot of the focus, of course, is on oil prices, and our indications of hydrocarbon commodities have seen the sharpest decline. And you can see there an indication that we expect this to be a significant reduction in demand for oil and gas, reflecting both slower industrial production as well as consumption. Interestingly, of course, though, not all commodities have moved the same way. Hydrocarbons and minerals and metals have all declined sharply. Food prices have seen, in aggregate terms, a more modest reduction. But of course, some food prices have actually seen increases. Of course, interestingly, for this region, rice prices have actually seen something like a 10% on average increase over the last couple of months, reflecting concerns not about the availability of supply. We believe there's adequate rice supply throughout the world to meet demand, but given concerns about possible trade restrictions and export restrictions. So it's perhaps interesting, we have to compare countries. For example, Malaysia, I'm going to give that example with apologies to my friends here, where you can see Malaysia, of course, is a net oil exporter. So weaker oil prices provide a negative terms of trade shock there, and is a net food importer. And so if we see higher food prices, you can see a sort of secondary impact there as well. And of course, at the country level, these vary depending on the net requirements for energy as well as other commodities such as food. And fourthly, of course, this is a region which trades extremely intensively with other countries around the world, both in goods and in services. And so there'll be many benefits and gains in terms of job creation, investment, and economic activity from that kind of openness. But it does mean, of course, that when we see a synchronized global slowdown in economic activity, that those processes go into reverse. And this chart just give you a little bit of an indication as to the intensity of export and import shares, both on goods and services, across some of the countries of our region here. And of course, most of the region is now under a lockdown of some sort. These are one of the exciting things, I think, as an economist working through this particular crisis, despite the very real human concerns associated with the disease, has been the resurgence of new high-frequency data sources, including big data. And of course, one of those is the mobility data, which has allowed us to get very rapid and real-time understanding as to where people are going or not going in response to some of the movement control restrictions and community quarantines that have been imposed across the region. That just gives you an indication on the right-hand side of the nature of the severity of the restrictions, particularly in, I think, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand over recent weeks, although we are now, of course, beginning to see the gradual changes in some of those restrictions as the pandemic starts to come under control. So given all of that, given slowing growth, weaker commodity prices, financial market volatility, slowdowns in trade in goods and services, it's no surprise that consensus growth forecasts are sharply down across the world. You'll notice, of course, the very sharp correlated nature of those changes between advanced economies and emerging market and developing economies, and that reflects the increasingly synchronized nature of global economic activity that we've seen over the recent decades. And of course, I think everybody now is projecting a recession at the global level for 2020, including even in emerging market and developing economies. That right-hand chart, if you're looking at those dates and thinking, are they wrong, is just comparing what happened in 2008-9 in the global financial crisis, to give you a sense of the sort of correlated slowdown in global growth that we saw that time round. Of course, then we saw that emerging market and developing economies still saw some positive growth. This time round, I think that's not entirely clear if that will be the case in 2020. And so hopefully these numbers are familiar to many of you. They were published by the World Bank a few weeks back. These were our baseline and lowercase growth projections for economies in East Asia. I would preface that these numbers are now a few weeks old, and of course, events continue to take place. We're seeing first quarter GDP numbers being released in a number of countries across the region last week, this week, and next week. But you'll see our baseline scenario is that most economies will experience something like 3 months of suppression activities before resumption of growth before the end of 2020 and a full return to growth in 2021. Our lowercase scenario is for a longer and deeper pandemic and response framework, which would only see a recovery starting in 2021. But even in the baseline scenario, we would project negative GDP growth in Malaysia and Thailand, and in the lowercase also in Philippines and Indonesia. And of course, with slower growth, that tremendously powerful driver that we've seen in East Asia over the last 20 years, where strong growth has driven poverty reduction, is potentially going into reverse. Those charts just show China and then excluding China. But of course, prior to COVID-19, we were expecting continued rapid rates of poverty reduction in the region this year as a response to continued strong growth. In our baseline scenario, we would expect poverty to, at best, remain flat in East Asia and Pacific, and in a lowercase scenario to increase by as many as 13 million people. And perhaps reflecting the likelihood of a baseline or a lowercase scenario, we would preface that the risks of a heavier downturn are still heavily tilted towards the downside. I think there's a risk both of a deeper downturn. So, for example, should the pandemic take longer to suppress than expected or require longer than expected mitigation measures, if some of the financial stresses that we've seen are exacerbated into a crisis, or if countries are perhaps unable to respond effectively to the crisis. Similarly, there's the risk, I think, of perhaps while the crisis might be dealt with to an extent, but we see a slower recovery. This is perhaps something more akin to an L-shaped rather than a U or V-shaped recovery due to longer lasting economic disruptions, higher debt burdens, a retreat from global integration through value chains, and perhaps a sort of growing public reaction to some of the measures that have been put in place to respond to the crisis. So I think many of you will be familiar with that left-hand chart there. This is something we've been all looking at over the last couple of months, the importance of flattening the curve to ensure that the caseload of COVID-19 cases falls within health system capacity. But as economists, we often, certainly in the World Bank, like to balance that particular curve, flattening the curve of the pandemic through containment, with what we call flattening the recession curve through complementary macroeconomic policies. Because of course, the most dramatic measures to flatten the health curve result in very dramatic recessionary impacts on our economies. And so it's important to consider mitigating macroeconomic measures, both fiscal, monetary, and financial, to try and soften the depth of the economic impact from health containment policies.
Richard, if I may ask you to wrap up in the next 3 minutes or so, maybe difficult, but as soon as you can, please. Thanks.
Sure, no problem.
I just want to leave a little bit of space for questions, I think, on the session. So thanks.
So we're seeing policies across 3 main areas: households, firms, and financial institutions, both to smooth consumption at the household level, as well as prevent bankruptcy and destruction at the firm level, and to avoid financial instability at the financial institution level. And so, of course, coming very much to the agenda for this meeting, fiscal policy is central to the COVID-19 response. And those charts, which I've actually extracted from the latest IMF fiscal monitor, show you just the dramatic changes in fiscal policy stance that we're seeing in 2020. Essentially, with pretty much all countries now moving to looser fiscal policy, both in advanced and emerging market economies in response to the crisis. And that's no surprise. In our region, we've seen some very dramatic policy responses, ranging from a mixture of new financing, tax reliefs, subsidies, business regulatory reforms, as well as financial injections. Perhaps I would preface these numbers are counting the number of policies, not necessarily their scale as a share of GDP. But countries across the region have responded rapidly with a range of policy instruments in response to the crisis. The challenge, of course, is that policy space is not the same for all countries of the region. Some countries are going into this crisis with higher levels of debt compared to others, with larger existing fiscal deficits and with larger private sector debt as well, and with more, and some countries have larger or relatively less large import covers. And so perhaps it's no surprise, though, that while most countries have responded rapidly to the crisis, the scale of the response varies, mostly in line with the availability of fiscal space in different countries of the region. Of course, some countries as well have relatively higher debt, both domestic and external, as well as foreign exchange denominated debt. And again, this has exerted a constraining factor on the response and of the scale of the fiscal impulse in response to the crisis. So if you see here, and perhaps I would indicate that these are there are difficulties sometimes in comparing the size of the fiscal package in response to the crisis. Some countries have included a number of non-fiscal measures in their response packages, and so we do have to be a little bit careful in deciding what's included and what's not included. But certainly what's interesting is that the size of fiscal policy responses has been significantly larger in advanced economies than in emerging market developing economies. Averaging about something like 14% in advanced economies and more like 2% in emerging market developing economies. I think Malaysia stands out as one of the economies that has had a relatively large response, although I would preface that 17% of GDP includes an awful lot of non-fiscal measures as well. Thailand is a little bit down on that list, although I understand that the latest measures have substantially amplified the size of the fiscal response there too. Just before I conclude, I think that here is a useful framework, again, that I borrowed from our friends of the IMF, thinking about the types of fiscal policy response to the crisis at both the firm and the household level, depending on the availability of fiscal space. Essentially, it's a more limited set of policy options for countries at the bottom half of these two charts who have more limited fiscal space, perhaps mostly around using guarantees and more limited policy choices compared to those who have a little bit more space to consider things like wage subsidies, direct loans, tax relief, and scaling up of cash transfers and social support networks. Finally, I think it's important to look back at what happened in some of the other shocks. Those of you who remember the 2008-9 global financial crisis will remember that a number of the tax policy measures that were taken then were very hard to roll back. And that's something we would emphasize to countries now. If you look at, in some parts of the world, it took several years before it was possible to unwind some of the incentives, deductions, allowances, and lower rates that were given. And so it's important to both balance the short-term needs to protect liquidity in the corporate sector with the long-term needs to manage fiscal sustainability and recovery. Also, of course, we would emphasize that a crisis is often a time to undertake useful structural reforms. That chart on the right-hand side just gives you an indication by our assessment of the tax potential from taxing more effectively the digital economy and e-commerce, particularly if we're moving to a model where digital development is going to be accelerated in the context of social distancing. It's important to not lose sight of some of the medium-term structural necessities around building an equitable tax base across both traditional and non-traditional means of supplying goods and services. So my final slide is perhaps to emphasize the importance of speedy decision-making with transparency. These are often conflicting priorities, but it's something that policymakers need to be conscious of, and thinking both of policies for the mitigation period as well as for the supporting a rapid recovery in a post-crisis world. And finally, of course, despite, I think, a challenging economic context, we are going to see substantially slower growth, and with the recession in several economies in this region in this year. I would emphasize that the fundamentals remain very strong. The reasons why East Asia has had such a strong growth performance over the last 20 years haven't changed. And these range, of course, from the diversified nature of economic structure, the relatively high levels of digital adoption and openness to trade integration, as well as past experience responding to and dealing to both economic and well as health crises in the last 20 years, and the strong foundations, particularly in terms of human capital, which will continue to drive growth over the medium term across East Asia. So with that, I think I can wrap up. We do have some additional resources there on the World Bank's COVID-19 resource page, as well as our regional report. And I think the slides will be circulated as well to participants after the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. Perhaps, sorry, I think there is still maybe somebody to mute. Perhaps we can spend the next 5 to 7 minutes on any questions that participants might have for Richard. I just want to say that, I mean, this was obviously a very rich and comprehensive presentation. It touches upon all the aspects that we heard both the speakers before, as well as probably the work and some of the details that we will hear in the specific country presentations. But if there are any particular questions for Richard, let's take them at this point. And of course, you can also ask them later if anybody doesn't want to come in at this point. But maybe we can use the raise hand feature, or somebody, whoever wants to come in, can shout and ask the question. I don't see any hands on the screen, but perhaps anybody from South Korea, at least I can't see the room at this point, but if you would like to come in, please do so. Just speak to the microphone.
We are connected. Can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay. We were just making sure if we are connected. We don't have any questions right now.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, we can hear and we can see you very clearly. Would our colleagues from the IMF like to come in, make any remarks at this point, any comments, any questions for Richard, or any points you'd like to put across? Holger? Holger, if you're trying to speak, I think you're mute. Now you are okay. You try to.
Can you hear me? No,
Yes.
I thought it was an excellent. I thought it was an excellent presentation. The figures on Thailand were, as Richard indicated, already a bit out of date. You know, the fiscal and the monetary stimulus in Thailand is quite considerable, related to the shock in the Thai economy, especially tourism and so on. So, we definitely think that this is not a time for contractionary policies. I think we're looking at implementing supplementary expenditure programs relatively fast, and I think countries also have to look, and I hope that will be part of the discussion this morning about how to implement emergency spending packages fast. Of course, there are implications of accountability and so on. Thailand has considerable experience now with cash handouts, and it would be interesting to discuss how other countries are faring with implementing social policies. I think, from our perspective, the digital solutions provide, an avenue for more speedy response than in the past. But there are definitely difficulties in that process. So I think we'd be interested to hear how the implementation of emergency measures is going in the region, and what PFM can do to provide support in accelerating the policy response. I'll keep it at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Holger. I think you make important points indeed. How can we have accountability and transparency in, moving large amounts of money and at a quick speed, as the case is? Anybody else who'd like to come in with questions for Richard at this point?
Can I have a question, Omar?
Yes, please. Pak Kunta, go ahead.
Thank you, Richard, for your presentation. It's very good for us to understand what the other countries they do about for us what the other countries do in this situation. But I want to know about, like you mentioned, most of the action is come from the government. So it means the fiscal policy. So we want to know what's the other countries in Asia about the role of the monetary policy or the role of the central bank in this situation. Because like in Indonesia, we have still discussion about the way the central bank, or we have the OJK. OJK is like Otoritas Jasa Keuangan, the financial authority. That sometimes the rule is overlap each other, or sometimes they didn't want to do anything. So it means that they make the government take all of this action. So I want to know about the other institution to have the role in this action. This is the first. The second, I see that most of the countries give a stimulus to the economy, something like a helicopter view to spread off the money to everybody. So what do you think about the impact on the inflation? Because like you mentioned, we have the global value chain, something like that, yeah. But when the global value chain is not working, so most of the industry in the country maybe not have a production or not produce something, because the global value chain is not work well in this situation. I think just two questions. Alma.
Thank you very much, Pak Kunta. Very good questions. Richard, over to you.
Right, thank you, Holger and Pak Kunta. I very much agree with Holger's statements. These are two interesting and challenging questions. I think firstly, perhaps the easier one on monetary policy. You're right. Many countries, again, both in advanced and in emerging market economies, have been undertaking dramatic and unconventional monetary policy responses to the crises. In fact, in many countries in this region, the monetary policy response came first, partly because it's somewhat less legislatively challenging for central banks to respond quickly, whereas, of course, fiscal authorities, it takes a little bit more time to prepare a response package. But we've seen policy rates cut dramatically, again, across the world. We've seen a number of what we would call sort of enhanced macro-financial measures, for example, changing of liquidity reserve requirements and other measures that essentially releases more liquidity and capital into the corporate and financial sectors, as well as perhaps most interestingly, what we call policy forbearance. So again, in a number of countries around the world, we've seen central banks essentially relax a lot of the macroprudential requirements that are normally put in place to preserve financial stability, again, essentially releasing requirements and capital requirements back into the corporate and financial sector. I think this third area is perhaps the most risky, if you like. I think it's understandable, and it's something that needs to be done, I think, with central banks' eyes very much wide open. But there are, of course, risks of short-term preserving liquidity in the system, but potentially start building up risks that might be more dramatic in the medium term. And of course, a lot of these measures, in contrast to fiscal policy, essentially are just transferring risk from one part of the financial system to another, essentially from corporates onto the balance sheets of commercial banks. And the risk, of course, is in the absence of adequate fiscal policy measures or a rapid recovery in demand, these risks will still materialize. I think that's important to keep in mind. Also, don't forget that a number of countries, and I'll perhaps highlight again Malaysia, have taken other measures, for example, deferred pension contributions. So reducing the amounts that both employees and employers make into public pension funds, again, provides short-term relief at both the household and the corporate level, although again, perhaps potentially causing some medium-term challenges around pension adequacy. Clearly, I think our advice is that countries, though, need to take a mixture of both monetary and fiscal policy measures as well as other measures. On inflation, I think the challenge is that all of us use the term stimulus to describe the dramatic fiscal policy measures that have been undertaken right now across the countries of the world, when actually those measures are not necessarily about stimulating economic activity. They're really about preserving patterns of consumption and well-being across both households and corporates. The reality is we're not trying to stimulate demand, we're trying to protect supply. So I think in the short term that the inflationary impact is probably going to be very modest. Essentially, what countries around the world are implementing cash transfers, wage subsidies, tax breaks, measures, transferals and directed lending, which protects cash and cash flow at the household level and at the corporate level to maintain structure and prevent damaging medium-term implications from the crisis. But I don't think that would be necessarily inflationary. The bigger challenge, perhaps, I think you hinted towards, is the medium term and the recovery phase. If we see the pandemic being suppressed, countries sort of returning back to economic activity, but still finding other parts of the world are locked down, or global value chains have become fragmented, or new trade barriers have emerged, then potentially we could see some inflationary dynamics. But in the same way, I think our response is now is perhaps the time to focus on fiscal spending and mitigating the impact of the crisis relative to perhaps credit ratings and debt sustainability. I think at the same way we would perhaps emphasize the higher priority of, again, preserving households and firms from the most dramatic impacts of the crisis, rather than worrying too much, at least in the short term, around the inflationary effects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I suggest that we move to the next session, and if there are further questions for Richard, please send them through the chat box in the WebEx, and we can ask them at the second round if needed. Let me invite now Ms. Ha, who is the head of the PEMNA Secretariat and Center for Asia-Pacific Fiscal Affairs in the Korea Institute of Public Finance, who will present a summary of the government of Korea fiscal response to COVID-19. She will present the survey results, a survey that they have carried out on the fiscal response to COVID in Korea. Ms. Ha, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alma. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kyung-sun Ha, head of PEMNA Secretariat. Today I'm going to present the survey result regarding the impact and policy response of COVID-19 in PEMNA region. Here's the outline of my presentation, and I will provide a quick explanation about the survey overview. Then I will explain the survey result about the economic impact, fiscal measures, and roles of MOF and budget staff. The survey was conducted from April 22nd to May 6th, which was yesterday, and it's very new. And it was online survey using SurveyMonkey. Out of 14 member countries, 10 provided the answers. The response rate is 71%. And thank you very much for all your support in such a short notice. The survey was constructed using 35 questions, asking about the economic impact and fiscal impact, health and fiscal measures, and the roles of MOF and budget staff. First, I would like to explain the result about the economic impact. Before we proceed, I'd like to give the picture about what is going on with the COVID-19. And the COVID-19 started from the China, but it has spread all over the world. And all 14 member countries in PEMNA reported the confirmed cases of COVID-19. The pattern of spread varies across the country, and it started from the China, then Korea, then to other countries. This slide shows the total number of confirmed cases in the PEMNA member countries. Since the data from the survey was incomplete, I rather used the data from IMF to show the economic impact in this region. As for the GDP growth rate, you see the shock in 2020, as shown in the picture. All the member countries are expected to decrease the GDP growth rate during the 2020. As for the inflation rate, it shows some mixed results across the countries. For some countries, the inflation rate would increase, but for others, it would decrease. Regarding unemployment rate, this chart shows that during the 2020, most of countries are expecting the increase of unemployment rate. The survey asked what are the 3 most affected industries, and the answer shows that tourism is the most affected industry in all countries, and aviation, transportation, manufacturing, and retail trading and agriculture followed. To measure the fiscal impact, we asked about the revenue and expenditure. As for the revenue, just 5 countries reported the answers. Only Korea remained the similar scale as original, but 4 other countries reported that like a 10 to 30% decrease in revenue in 2020. In terms of expenditure, Philippines would answer that they would remain as the same scale, but for other countries, they all expect the increase of total expenditure in 2020 to combat with the COVID-19. The next part asked about the fiscal measures of the member countries. We were wondering how the member countries finance the health measures, and the answer shows that health sector in current budget and reallocation of the current budget are the most preferred ways to finance the health measures. And they also answered that reserved fund and financial aid from foreign countries would also the way to handle the health measures. Many countries are working on the supplementary budget. 80% of the respondents said that they are working on supplementary budget. And several countries provided the actual numbers for this budget. And as you all know, these are all evolving, so they are not the final number. But this table shows just the current picture of what is going on here. To finance the supplementary budget, the government are trying to many ways, and government borrowing and cutting capital spending and issue of government bonds and financial aid from foreign countries are all the options in their survey questions. To finance the supplementary budget, like 70% of all the respondents, they answered they expect the increase of government borrowing during this year. The next question is about the stimulus package. And we have 10 respondents in the survey, and they all said yes about this stimulus package. And for most of them, this is not just one time. They said it's 3 or more than 3 times, and it could be more. Cash handout is one of the preferred way to provide financial aid, and 80% of the respondents, they are working on this cash handout, and it could be one-off, or it could be continuous, or both. To distribute the cash handout, the deposit to the individual bank account was the most preferred method to distribute. And real cash payment are also mentioned in the answers. Regional gift certificate is also one of the options. Tax measures are also preferred fiscal measures in the member countries. Tax reduction and tax defer and tax exemption are frequently used in the member countries, and tax rebate are also mentioned in the answers. This table shows which tax measures are used in each country. The financial aid for households are using various methods, and restructuring loan structure and loan deferment are the most preferred way as the financial aid for the household, and easy liquidity constraint and relief deal regulation are also mentioned in the answers. This table shows which financial aid for households are used in each country. Similar questions are also asked about the financial aid for business, and restructuring loan is the most favored financial aid method here, and loan deferment and easy liquidity and relief deregulation are also the ways to provide financial aid for business. This table shows which measure is for business in each country. All member countries are concerned about the SMEs, and lots of fiscal measures are being conducted to support SMEs. And among those, soft loans is the most preferred ways, and wage subsidies and training education program support and cash handout and market development and innovation support are also used to support SMEs. This table shows which fiscal measures are used in each country, and it also shows other options being used in Indonesia and Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam. Many countries are easing financial regulation to provide fiscal measures, and among those, procurement of goods and services and ministry spending limits and government borrowing limits are preferred ways as the way of easing financial regulations. The survey also asked whether there is any specific policy response in each member countries, and Indonesia, Korea, Malaysia, Myanmar, and Philippines provided the answer to this question. It includes very specific policy response like a social safety net and prepayment and lowering rent fee campaign and the change of the procurement process. And this table shows all the details in the answers. The last part of the survey asked about the roles of MOF and budget staff in the time of this COVID crisis. All the respondents answered that cooperation with other relevant ministries, local government to accelerate spending approvals and reallocate funds within the ministry budget is the most required and expected role for the MOF budget staff. And the next preferred answer was the reallocation of 2020 budget by refocusing the priorities. And also the monitoring, the execution, and the prepared supplementary estimate budget are also the expected roles for the MOF and budget staff. There are also challenges and issues for MOF and budget staff. As you know, there are lots of challenges, but in the survey, the respondent answered the most challenging issue is to estimate the economic damage from this COVID-19. And the next issue was the financing the fiscal measures and negotiation selection of policy options with political leaders. This survey was conducted during the very short time period, and I really appreciate all your support for this survey. And if there's anything to be corrected or updated, please let us know. And this slide will be uploaded on the PEMNA webpage. And we like to hear from all the new updates and the evolving things from your country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, for the presentation. This was actually a very interesting survey. I think it will probably be useful for us to maybe carry out this survey at certain points in time and try to update this information and enrich the analysis. So can I ask if there are questions for Ha's presentation on the survey, the results, any specific country issues related to it? Anybody would like to come in with questions for the survey results?
Hi, South Korea. I'm Kyung-chul Nam. Thank you, Dr.
Yes.
He. I think this is very, very useful. It helped us to understand each other, and we came to know that we are very same, but still different in policies. But one thing is that even South Korea is still fighting the pandemic, and fiscal measures are still made. Tomorrow or another stimulus packages will be announced. So I think it will be good if we keep updating this material to the end, at the end of the year, and share again. That will be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we can probably also enrich it with more questions and maybe depending on how the circumstances and the situation evolves. But indeed, that's a very good suggestion. Anybody else? Maybe we can take one more question and then move to the next session. I think we have Mr. Sorry, Sokhang. You might be muted if you're trying to talk. Perhaps can unmute.
Are you talking about
Yes.
me? Oh, okay. Can I add one more question? I'm not sure if participant from Philippines is here right now, but I have one question about the result of the survey. The survey told that Philippines they would not raise their expenditure for the COVID-19. They would not raise expenditure, but I found that according to the survey, they are doing their economic support packages for the COVID-19. So I was wondering what was their resource for such economic package? Are they reallocating their original plan for their budget? So I think it would be also helpful if the Secretariat could find out what are the Philippines' plan for its expenditure, or if the participant from the Philippines is here right now, it will be very thankful if they answer my question.
Sure, that's great. Actually, maybe we can collect, I think there are two more people that wanted to ask questions. I think it's Mr. Lei, one of them, before Mr. Reis from Philippines responds. Mr. Lei, would you like to come in? And I think, and I know that Philippines will come in session C, so you can also respond when you talk about the Philippines case, Yolanda, if you would like to, and in the next session. But let me go to again, Mr. Lei, if you like to ask a question, please go ahead.
Actually, I don't have a question, but when I look at the presentation, I did not see the Cambodia included in the case study. I just want to know why do you have a problem with the data collection from Cambodia, or it's not, why it's not included in the survey?
Hi, this is Doi from the PEMNA Secretariat. We several asked complete the survey several times, but the focal point, I guess he we didn't receive any, we didn't receive the response from Cambodia side. But we will share the survey question after the webinar, and then you can complete, because we're using this survey results as a report. So in the case, you can complete the survey after this webinar. Sorry about it.
Sounds good. Bernard, did you also want to ask a question, or did I understand this?
No, but I think Mr. Late had a follow-up comment and he was on mute, so you just want to check.
Okay. Mr. Late, did you want to come in again?
You'll have to unmute. I think he's still muted, so
Yeah, do you hear me?
We can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yes, we can. Please send me the survey questionnaire, and then we can fill up information for you.
All right, thank you so much.
The reason the focal point person did not send you information because he went to the New Zealand and then he now has been locked in the New Zealand, so he don't have he does not contact me, so I can't send information to you. Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very useful. So perhaps if there are no further questions, I will then go to session C and thank Ms. Ha for the presentation, and then go to session C, and we can start with the Philippines. So we have Ms. Yolanda Reyes, who will, in this session, we will have very brief updates from the various countries. So we have 4 countries that have, Mr. Lei, if you could please mute the microphone if possible. So we will have a presentation from the Philippines, from Myanmar, and from Thailand and Malaysia on very brief updates on the measures that these member countries are taking. So perhaps we can start with Philippines, Ms. Reyes, and you can also respond to the question that was asked following Ms. Ha's presentation.
Okay, good morning, everyone.
2-3 minutes, please.
Okay, this is the current Philippine situation under the COVID-19. In view of the extremely challenging economic landscape amid the COVID-19 pandemic, the Philippines took a more conservative stance by adopting a worst-case scenario in terms of growth and fiscal targets for this year. This will allow the government to operate on more grounded and realistic assumptions as it flags downside risks that constrain the attainment of the original pre-pandemic growth prospects and fiscal targets, especially revenue collections and borrowing requirements. The country's economic growth is now expected to settle between negative 1.0 to 0% from the original target of 6.5 to 7.5%. Total revenues are projected to be lower by some $318.9 billion, or equivalent to $6.3 billion, or 9.1% when compared to the original program, mainly on account of the weak external and domestic economic environment amidst the COVID-19 situation. On the other hand, we are maintaining the original disbursement program of $4.1 trillion, equivalent to $82.2 billion, which is also 22.1% of the GDP. This will enable the government to implement priority programs and projects, mainly for the health, social protection-related activities that will contain the COVID-19 contagion, as well as other programs and projects that will help various affected sectors and industries recover from the economic slowdown. As a result, the fiscal deficit for the year will reach $990.1 billion, or equivalent to $13.1 billion, and equivalent to 5.3% of GDP. The combination of the higher deficit and lower projected economic growth will result to an end-of-year debt to GDP projection of around 46.7%. Given the conservative fiscal stance the government has been implementing since 2010, it can afford this needed leeway. All these are being continuously reviewed by the Philippine government. To strengthen the government's capacity to address COVID-19 pandemic, the Philippine Congress has passed Republic Act number 11469, or the Bayanihan, which refers to cooperation to Heal as One Act on March 24 this year. The law seeks to address the social and economic needs of the public, especially the most vulnerable segments throughout and after the pandemic. The law authorizes the President to reprioritize the budget to augment the allocation for any item directly related to support operations and response measures which are necessary or beneficial in order to address the COVID-19 emergency. As of April 23, the releases under the said law for COVID-19 response amounts to 350.4 billion, or an equivalent of 6.9 billion US dollars. This includes the 196 billion subsidy for 18 million low-income households and another 51 billion, or around 1 billion US dollars, wage subsidy for some 3.4 million employees in small businesses, both for 2 months. That's equivalent to the lockdown. Moving forward, we have a technical working group on anticipatory and forward planning that is in charge of formulating the plans and strategies for the new normal scenario with the objective of rebuilding the economy and help worst-affected sectors recover. The recommendations will include policies and steps to facilitate the transition to the new normal situation and allow the continuity of government operations and implementation of its priority programs and projects. This will be factored in the ongoing formulation of the 2021 national budget. And as a result, implementing departments or agencies are given the option to reprioritize their programs, activities, and projects to be funded in the next year's budget using the new normal parameters. And I must add in the earlier question that there are ongoing efforts between the executive branch and Congress of the Philippines, which just resumed session early this week, to work on the economic stimulus package that will have to be approved on. This is the answer to the earlier question, why you're asking us, we just maintain the level of the budget. Aside from that, we are working on this economic stimulus package to be decided by both Congress and the executive. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Reyes. Perhaps we can go to Myanmar, Ms. Sansan Oh.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you? Oh, thank you. So, good morning, the ladies and gentlemen. So, I'm going to share about our country experience regarding with the COVID-19 affair response in Myanmar. So, Myanmar confirmed the COVID-19 disease in the March 24, and currently the 160 confirmed case and the 6 people dead, and the 30 people recover from the disease. As economic impact due to the COVID-19 outbreak, the CMB business, hotel and tourism company, and the SME will have suffered the most negative economic consequences, as the later consequences for the investment and export have affected. According to the World Bank estimate, our real GDP growth is projected to slow between 2 and 3% in fiscal year 2019-20. Growth is expected to slowly recover to 6% in fiscal year 2021 and then to trend on the back of investment in tax, commercial tax, rental fee of the government and leaseholder, exemption of the 2% withholding tax and tourism license fee due to the above effects. So government revenue will be declined in the current year. In order to overcome the intermediate negative impact of COVID-19, government issued a comprehensive economic stimulus plan, namely COVID-19 Economic Relief Plan. This plan consists of the 7 goal 10 strategy, 36 action plan, and the 76 action. covering the broad range of the extraordinary fiscal measure combined with a set of human focus and the common sense policy response. We could say that our CEMB plan seeks to flatten the curve without flattening our economy. So currently, Myanmar government is taking the necessary action to prevent and containment measure of the COVID-19. And the first action is the COVID-19 fund has been established a capital of the Myanmar jet 100 billion to provide loan to CMB business, hotel and tourism, company and SMEs which are suffering the most negative impact with the concessionaire. One is the 10% of the total junior expenditure is at loan and grant of fiscal year 2019-20, about 2.5 trillion MMK will be reduced, and these are allowed to take preventive and containment measure of the COVID-19. That one is the providing the people who are from the basic status of the society without regular income with the basic food such as the rice, cooking wine, salt, lentil, and the onion for the each household starting from the 10 April through the state and region government. Moreover, household electricity bill will be given exemption of up to the 150 unit for the month of April to the public religious organization and the local humanitarian organization. The fourth one is the concerning the CBM business, hotel and the tourism company and the small and medium enterprise SME, quarterly payment period of the income tax, monthly payment period of the commercial tax for the fiscal year 2019-20 will extend to the 30th September 2020. And the fifth one is the 2% of the income tax levies in advance of the export will be exempted under the end of the fiscal year. The sixth is the Central Bank of Myanmar has reduced the interest rate 3 times up to the 3%. Concerning the CBM interest rate, deposit interest rate, and the loan interest rate. The seventh is the collection rental of the lease of the hotel defer for the 6 months. And the eighth one is the tourism license, and the permission of the renewal of license fee will be exempted for 1 year. The ninth is for the control of the treatment of COVID-19, state and region government have been allowed to use contingency fund 1 billion, which have been approved for the state and region budget fiscal year 2019-20 for contingency case. For the action of the healthcare, currently Ministry of Health and the Sport will use the US dollar 10.7 billion International Fund for Prevention and Control Measure against the COVID-19, which is from the Gavi and the US aid. Sport from the partner side, the political leadership, people measure, people participation, and sport partner will need to perform. Therefore, emergency needs for during COVID-19 period, recovery period, and the 1 year later after infection period are performed, be receiving assistance. So therefore, the government of Myanmar is coordinating with the donor country international organization to get the necessary assistance. This is the currently COVID-19 affairs response in our country. So we also want to learn the other PEMNA member country experience. That's all, and thank you very
much. We do have a question for Philippines and I think Indonesia as well, but let us go through the presentations and then we'll go to a session of questions. And then, so I will invite Ms. Kulkanya Lekyananda for a presentation on Thailand.
Hello. Okay, for Thailand, the government has approved 3 phases of fiscal package. The first 2 was in March, and the third one was in April, and the 3 is totaling of around 2.2 trillion baht, or around 65 billion US dollars. And under this package, the government will be able to borrow around 1 trillion, and the remaining will be budget transfer or reallocation of the fiscal year 2020 and 2021. Under the phase 3 of the fiscal package, it's around 1.9 trillion baht, or 57.5 billion US dollars. around 80% of it will be used for healthcare, individual financial assistance. This is the most of it will be the cash handout for around 16 million people in total, and for economic and social rehabilitation, and also 20% of it will be for to set up the corporate bond stabilization fund. And let me go back to the phase 1 and phase 2. Most of it will be tax relief measure, soft loans for SMEs. And yes, that should be all for Thailand. You.
Thank you very much. You were definitely within the time, so that's perfect. Thanks a lot. Thank you for sticking to the time. And then the final one is one for Malaysia. So we have Mr. Moda Sanamat. Hello, Mr. Amat.
Hello. Yeah.
Please
could you?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Could you hear me? Yeah. Yeah. As far as for Malaysia, due to the COVID pandemic outbreak, slowdown in global growth, and as well as a significant deterioration in the crude oil prices, this has impacted our growth businesses as well as the public at large. Thus, as a responsible and caring government, the role of fiscal policy will be highly effective, particularly during the economic shock. In this regard, the government also has introduced this MCO of Movement Control Order. We are fully aware that the impact is severe to our businesses and economic activities, which are highly dependent on the movement of goods and people. Thus, the government has taken a bold step in facing this unprecedented crisis in our country history by announcing and implementing a comprehensive stimulus package amounting to RM 260 billion, or nearly 18% of GDP. The size of this stimulus is almost 4 times bigger than the last economic stimulus back in global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. Given the weakening external demand as well as the lower domestic activities, the government is focusing on boosting household consumption in order to stimulate economy in 2020. It is a two-pronged approach, which is number one, to assist those who are directly affected due to loss of income, and secondly is to revive the domestic economy post-recovery. Furthermore, businesses will receive assistance to ease their cash flow difficulties. The government also looking at a project that have a high multiplier impact and swift implementation mechanism in the short run. This measure is expected to cushion the slowdown in the GDP growth for Malaysia, even though we internally were expected 2020 is a recession year. I think most of the country will cope with that. In this regard, there are 3 main thrusts in our stimulus packages. Number one is protecting the people. This is where we give a direct cash assistance to bottom 40 and mid 40 household. This will account around 10 billion ringgit. And second thrust is to continue to promote these business activities, of which we will give one of the thing is wage subsidy to the businesses to at least they can retain the employee and not to retrench their employees. We also provide facilities or financing fund for the SMEs to get some assistance, at least to cushion their businesses. On the third thrust is to continue protecting the economy. This is where a small infrastructure, basic administrative project will be carried out in order to ensure that this can cushion and prolong to support the economy. All these measures, this is very crucial. Yeah, all these measures is a one-off in that sense that we wanted to ensure that in the near term, we could resume back to our fiscal consolidation. It must be all measures is one-off and temporary in that sense. So we can easily to enhance our fiscal positions and also our lowering our debt level post recovery. I think that's some updates from Malaysia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All very useful indeed. I think we have, by the way, whoever wants to send further questions, either raise your hand or send them through the chat box. We have one in the chat box already, and that is for Philippines. So the person would like to know what is to have the Philippines talk about the easing of financial regulations during COVID-19. Actually, the question is both for Philippines and for Indonesia. If Indonesia would like to take it later, because we have a presentation from Indonesia in the next session, we can also do that. But may I ask Ms. Reyes, would you like to come in on that question? So the question is, can you tell us about the easing of financial regulations during the COVID-19, if you know about that?
Well, essentially, the law I mentioned earlier, which is actually to address the COVID-19 pandemic, approved by Congress on March 24, includes a provision on the easing of financial aspects. Basically, that covers both interest rates in terms of monetary, and also because we know for instance, during the period of the lockdown, that is equivalent to 2 months, people are given the option not to pay their monthly amortization, and that's one of those covered under the law. And of course, we know there are repercussions brought about by that provision, but the intention is really to help people, especially those those with amortizations, interest to pay, to be at least given leeway in terms of the 2 months lockdown. That's as far as I know.
Okay, thank you very much. In Indonesia, Pak Kunta, would you like to come in, or Mr. Vibowo?
I think Pak Rufianto will speak. Yeah, Heru. Pak Rofi is there.
Pak Heru.
Good morning, everybody. So I think regarding what the need in terms of the regulation in Indonesia, of course, to provide the stimulus, to provide the stimulus to the economy and the poor people, the government need to change some law, and also some regulation, especially in terms of budget implementation, because according to our public financial law, for the budget deficit for each fiscal year, maximum is 3%. Of course, this 3% is not enough if we want to provide or add stimulus to the economy or to the poor people. That's why we need to change the law and to extend our deficit to above 5%. And also, I think we need also to change the law regarding the role of the central bank, because previously for the central bank, it is not allowed to buy the government bond in the primary market. So I think we need to change, and according to the new regulation, it is allowed for the central bank to take step to buy the government bond in the primary market. So I think there are some regulations that we need to change as the response to mitigate or to respond the pandemic COVID. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak. Any further questions, or shall we move? In the interest of time, maybe we can move to the next session. We have 3 more country presentations, and we will start with the first one, which is the Korean experience, so Korean fiscal response to COVID-19. called Up to the Sixth Measure. So we have the presenter is Mr. Nam, and the Director of Fiscal Management and Coordination Division in the Ministry of Economy and Finance of Korea. Over to you, Mr. Nam.
Hello, everyone. I'm very honored to give a short presentation to the PEMNA community. Do you see my slide or my face? Do you see my face or slide?
Now we see your slides. Yeah, we can see the presentation now.
Okay, good. Okay, on the first page, there is a photo. It's a cabinet meeting presided by the President Moon. I think it's very symbolic because the President has presided the meeting every week and produced so many fiscal measures up to now. So if you count, we had produced 6 comprehensive measures till now for the economy. Let me summarize our experience here. So at the early stage, Korea has been the hotspot of coronavirus after the China, because there was a very big cluster contamination in a small city in Daegu, but that was the occurrence is decreased now. So the first case in Korea reported in mid-January, and the government raised the alert level and responded to that. And I think we were very swift. At the early stage, we provided resources to the Ministry of Health with reserve fund or reallocation of a current budget to support disease control. And then we made first extra budget, and then second extra budget, and then we are preparing third extra budget now. As of April, all inbound travelers are subject to 2-week self-quarantine in Korea, but domestic contamination is a very rare case now. So in terms of disease control, the policy is focusing on test, trace, and treat. Because it's a very interesting point, I want to introduce a few cases. So you see this drive-through diagnosis picture on the right side. So there are more than 100 of test sites, and then 20,000 tests are executed per day. And we have tested 600,000, more than 600,000 cases so far. And then once you are confirmed, and the government or local government trace the contacts by the use of credit card or the CCTV on a restaurant or personal smartphone GPS location, and we use a safety and protection app, and then those ICT application was very useful at the early stage to tackle the virus. So, in summary, early protection and screening and tracing and intensive treat were very, very helpful for the recovery. And the fatality rate is very low in Korea. It is at 1.9% now. So the banded curve, it is already flattened and banded. New confirmed cases per day is just 1 or 2 or single-digit number nowadays. And most of the confirmed cases recovered from the disease, and 200 people dead, and the economy is reopening now. But the impact on economy so far is very significant. In terms of employment, 200,000 there has been 200,000 job loss in March, and it was the dramatic decrease since 2009 Asian financial crisis. By industry, service jobs went down due to weak hotels and restaurants, wholesale, retail, and education services. And mostly daily workers and temporary workers were severely affected. In terms of stock market, the KOSPI and KOSDAQ, the stock has dropped more than 10% in March. So in overall, the economy shrank 1.4% from the previous quarter. Manufacturing were hit hardest, and the service fell 2%. On expenditure side, private consumption dropped 6.4%. But if you look at the government consumption, the government consumption in quarter one rose 0.9%. This is interesting. It is because we also made some efforts to increase government consumption by encouraging the ministries to execute their budget as early as possible. So there has been countless fiscal measures decided by the president and announced so far. I think it has been hectic for the finance ministry guys like you. I believe it will be the same to your country. We launched a variety of fiscal measures to overcome the difficulties. These measures include support for the SME, 2 rounds of extra budget, and beyond this, we are still continuing to explore various ways to help the economy. So, in total, 245 trillion Korean won, which is about 245 billion US dollar. And it accounts for more than 12% of GDP. Support has been unveiled so far, and it includes stimulus for the real economy and financial market stabilization, and special funds to protect the key industries, and additional measures for the families and increase consumption. Let me introduce our first supplementary budget. The Korean fiscal year 2020, this year's budget is $500 billion US dollar, and we added 11.7 billion US dollar as the extra budget. And it includes disease control, helping small businesses, and helping households, and reviving local economies. I think these programs will be very same and similar to your countries. So I will skip this. And financial support. It is not budget, you know. Well, it is worth more than 100 billion US dollar, and it focuses on providing liquidity to the small enterprises, providing guarantees for the SMEs, and loans for the startups and venture capital. And there was also a money injection to the financial market to stabilize bond market and to protect stock market. And this is one thing that I personally involved in making the policies. I think it will be an interesting case. We also made another fiscal policies worth 3.3 trillion Korean won, which was 3.3 billion US dollar worth project. So you know, government is consumer, government is buyer, and we focused on reinforcing government roles as the buyer of last resort. Government uses money and consumes money, and it helps the economy. So within the program, the concept is simple. Within the given budget or without extra budget, we push the public sector agencies to implement their budget as soon as possible in the first of the year. And the public sector consumption have affected sectors like aviation, restaurants, agriculture, or car-making industries. First, government will push the highest possible level of prepayment to prevent consumption cliff. You pay in credit card in advance and use it later. And international travel expenses will be cancelled, but we paid to the airliners already, and we will use it later in the we'll use it later. Service outsourcing contract from the government will be contracted in advance, and 80% of full contract payment will be prepaid. Second, government will buy anything possible as soon as possible to support consumption. We will accelerate purchasing vehicles for public use vehicles, facial masks, and smart devices for low-income students for online education, or crude oil. And infrastructure investment also accelerated to support construction industries. These all measures were not about extra budgeting. It is using current budget and use it timely as early as possible. And recently we finished the second supplementary budget, which was very, very controversial in the political arena in Korea. It was 12 billion US dollar, and then the government gives 1,000 US dollars to all families for consumption. Money, cash transfer, it is cash transfer. But originally, our ministries planned to give it to the families on the income level of 70. I mean the poorer families, not all families. But the ruling party and the president want to give it to all the families. So it has been quite political controversy, but finally the budget was approved in the National Assembly. So this is the last slide. The characteristics of Korean experience, I think. We had actually experienced a lot of crises in our histories, like Asian financial crisis in 1998, 2009 global financial crisis, and more. And recently, there has been MERS disease crisis 4 years ago in Korea. So those past experience is very, very helpful to making new policies. And I think the Korea's policies is like a department store. We have everything because we are benchmarking the advanced countries and other countries, and we are always looking to other countries. So I think our actions must be very preemptive, comprehensive, and targeted in grand scale. And we also introduced a very new idea try, like I said, in the prepayment program slide in these new circumstances. And with a second supplementary budgeting, there has been a big social discussion on whether we should give it all families or 70% of families. So I think it raised people's awareness how government is spending. I think it's a good process that Korea recently found. This is the end of my presentation. I think our presentation will be helpful, and would like to further share and learn from your experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Huang. This was really very, very interesting. I mean, in particular, if I might just sort of mention this experience of Korea with the prepayments, the advanced payments is very interesting, and something that at least I have not seen in the other countries that we've been looking at, but very, very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Maybe we will take questions all at the end. So let me go to the other country. We'll go to Vietnam, and we have Mr. Nguyen Minh Tan, who is the Deputy Director of the State Budget. Mr. Tan, the floor is yours.
Xin chào quý vị. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Cũng như là các quý vị tham dự với participants in this webinar. Tôi cũng rất là hân hạnh được bày cái kinh nghiệm của Việt Nam về các giải pháp phá. Share with you the experience of Vietnam about fiscal measures in response to the pandemic impact. Như các quý vị cũng biết thì Việt Nam chúng tôi, as you may know, có một cái đường biên giới rất dài. Vietnam has a long borderline with China. Và Việt Nam là một trong các quốc gia được đánh giá là sẽ bị ảnh hưởng rất lớn của đại dịch. Was one of the countries that were assessed as being severely affected by the COVID-19. Thế thì về phía chính phủ Việt Nam thì có thể nói from the government of Vietnam rất là sớm và có những hành động rất phù hợp. Very early actions, and we took very relevant actions. Ngay từ khi bắt đầu phát sinh dịch bệnh ở Vũ Hán, right đã theo dõi sẽ hearing about the disease from Japan. Có những cái we monitor hành động closely, and the government took để ngăn chặn cái sự phát triển của dịch bệnh đối với the development of the pandemic in Vietnam. Sớm các for example, we công dân Việt Nam từ Vũ Hán, you know, isolate very early the Vietnamese citizens coming back to the country, repatriate from Wuhan. Giãn ly, cách ly xã hội. We also practiced social distancing. Từng bước từ cái mức độ là gọi là theo từng cái đợt, trong đó chuyển ra. And we worked in different phases, you know, first for different groups, and then to the whole society. Và nhờ những cái biện pháp như vậy thì nói the action ở Việt Nam là khá ổn định. The situation in Vietnam now is quite stable. Như các quý vị cũng biết là tổng số ca nhiễm của Việt Nam know that the total number of 270 ca và chưa có Vietnam is 271, and we have no death case. Từ ngày mùng 4 tháng 5 trở đi thì starting from Việt Nam đã chính thức thực hiện cái giảm thiểu, tức là giảm dần các Vietnam is now giãn cách xã hội và our practice of social là đã trở lại. And resuming to the new normal. Thế thì có thể nói rằng là tác động của dịch bệnh đối với kinh tế của Việt Nam là cũng rất là lớn. The impacts of the pandemic to the society and economy of Vietnam seems to be quite substantial. Ngay ở những thời điểm ban đầu, even in the early time, cái tình hình dịch bệnh ở Trung Quốc đã dẫn tới cái sự gián đoạn về chuỗi cung nguyên liệu đầu vào. China stopped our supply chains and trade flows already. Sau khi mà Trung Quốc cơ bản tạm ổn đối với tình hình, once China was xuất nhập khẩu với Trung Quốc, Việt Nam Trung Quốc dần trở lại được bình thường. Chúng tôi lại đối mặt với lại cái import and export with China, dịch bệnh trên toàn cầu. And then we have to face về the pandemic outspread globally. Xuất khẩu hàng hóa. Then we also suffer from the disruption of supply chains globally. Có nghĩa là chúng ta vừa mới thoát khỏi được cái gián đoạn đầu vào thì lại dẫn tới gián đoạn đầu ra. After you know being faced with the input shocks, and now we are facing the output shocks. Ở trong nước thì cái dịch bệnh đã trực tiếp tác động đến cái hoạt động của cái lĩnh vực như là du lịch. In the country, several industries are impacted like y tế, giáo dục, exports, tourism, food and commerce, rồi lao động việc làm, health, education, employment. Cái kết quả thực hiện của cái quý 1 cho thấy rằng là cái tổng kinh tế của Việt Nam đã quarter 1 giảm. Can see that the growth 3,82% thôi. So mục tiêu đề ra là 8%. And compared to the target of 6.50%. So it means that half of the target was reduced. Cái achieve half of the target. Số giá tiêu dùng CPI thì trong quý 1 thì tăng cao hơn so với mục tiêu. The CPI in quarter 1 increased higher than the target. Ở đây là nó ước tính 5,56%. The estimate was about 5.56% compared to 2.66 or 2.8% last year. Kim ngạch nhập khẩu hàng hóa giảm mất 1,9%. Imports of goods decreased by 1.9%. Và hơn 153.000 người. More than 153,000 jobs were lost. Với cái điều kiện như thế này, so under that conditions, Bộ Tài chính Việt Nam phối hợp với lại các the Ministry of Finance of Vietnam is working with other agencies to do some projections for our economic growth. Cái kịch bản mà lạc quan nhất mà chúng tôi nhận định là most optimistic scenario. Dịch bệnh nó sẽ kết thúc vào the pandemic can be easing in quarter 2 in Vietnam. And then giữa quý 3, in the middle of quarter 3, the pandemic will be easing globally. So the GDP growth can be from 5 to 5.3%. Nhưng có nghĩa là có giảm so với means that is lower than our targets of by about 1.5%. Trong trường hợp mà dịch bệnh mà nó kết thúc muộn hơn. So in case the pandemic lasts longer and the global situation is not improving, suy giảm tăng trưởng kinh tế, I think that the economic growth will be much worse. Thì cái mức sâu hơn này thì chúng tôi đang and for the worst case scenarios, we think that the GDP can be 4%. Một số quốc tế, some international organizations believe that GDP of Vietnam, GDP growth in Vietnam now in this year can be 3% or below 3%. Lấy ví dụ như là World Bank, for example, World Bank's projection is about 3% for the worst case. The IMF's the projection is about 2.7%. Thì có thể nói là đấy, cái tác động của cái với lại kinh tế Việt Nam là cũng khá là nặng. It means that Vietnam is quite severely struck by the pandemic. Tức là cái giải pháp ứng phó của Việt Nam, the response measures of Vietnam, thì có thể nói rằng các cái giải pháp ứng phó, I think that our measures are mentioned seem to be comprehensive, bao gồm enough lĩnh vực từ we cover areas cho đến from the economy to the financial sector. Thì cái giải pháp đầu tiên đưa ra đâu, the first measure of the government dập dịch is to mitigate and và control the pandemic as soon as possible. Với quan điểm đó thì ngay từ khi mà bắt đầu in mind from the beginning of the pandemic, the government increased our investments for the health sector. Và chúng tôi cũng tăng cường cái mức cho các also increased the spending for those participating in the combat against the pandemic. Và cũng trong thời điểm đấy thì at the same time tiến hành cái việc giảm cái thuế also reduce the y tế, import duties for medical supplies, các cái máy thở, for example ventilators and other equipment, hay là các cái vật tư or materials and other medical supplies for the production of masks and sanitizers. Thế rồi cũng thời điểm đó thì chính phủ at the same time the government về mặt tín dụng also announced the credit support for enterprises. Dự kiến là the credit support package was estimated to be 250 trillion dollars. Thì nó đã được nâng, and by now it's increased to 350 trillion dollars. Chúng tôi cũng áp dụng cái biện pháp apply the measures đóng các cái gọi là cái bảo hiểm xã hội to allow the deferred payments of our union memberships and social insurance contributions from employers and employees. Rồi cho phép là we also allow các cái chủ doanh nghiệp được employers hỗ trợ tín dụng với mức lãi suất to receive subsidized credits with zero interest rates or subsidized interest rates to retain employment during the COVID period. So these are the overall measures. I would like to go into the fiscal measures. In terms of the fiscal measures, we worked both on the revenue side and the expenditure side. For the state budget revenue, we rescheduled tax payments for the businesses, including land rents from businesses. Total deferred tax package is about 8 billion USD. And the deferment period is to the end of 2020. It means 31st of December 2020. Depending on the situation, we may want to reschedule and extend the deferred tax payments at the beginning of 2021. I would like to share that according to the laws of Vietnam, the rescheduling of tax is in the authorities of the government, and it can be valid for 1 year. So that's why this package will last until the 31st of December. In the second measure, we also require ministries and agencies to review and to reduce fees and charges so as to reduce the operation costs for businesses. Thirdly, we are proposing to the National Assembly in the next May meeting for the adjustments of the dependency deduction for corporate income tax. And then we may also propose exemption of agricultural land use tax. And to reduce tax for SMEs. I mean income tax for SMEs. So that's on the revenue side. On the expenditure side, in addition to the package to as entitlements for those participating in the combat against the pandemic, we also adopt a policy to provide direct support for employees with a package of about 3 billion USD. So the beneficiaries are employees that have their employment contracts suspended or have to take forced leave due to the pandemic. So they are entitled 1.8 million VND per person per month, which is about 7 USD each month over 3 months. We also support for employees losing their jobs. The package is 1 billion BND per person per month, which means about 45 USD per month. We also support the social protection entitled beneficiaries and nationally merited persons. The level of support is 500,000 per month per person, which is about 20 USD. I mean, these beneficiaries are under social protection, but this is in addition. We also support household businesses with the revenues of below 100 million VND per year, and the entitlement is about 45 USD per household per month. For the poor and the near poor households, they are also supported. This is additional support in addition to the existing entitlements. The level is about 12 USD per person per month. What I mean is that these are cash transfers to the persons. In total, the package is about 3 billion USD. We are also having some plans. These are the existing policies that are used in the last 4 months. For the time being, government is considering some additional measures so as to support and stimulate the economy and for the recovery after the pandemic. And in measures that we are considering, we may want to propose
giảm 50% lệ phí
50% deduction of car registration fees so as to boost the purchase of cars, to encourage the automobile industries.
Rồi miễn phí bảo lãnh phát sinh trong năm 2020 cho các cái doanh nghiệp hàng không.
We also, try to reduce the fees for aviation companies.
Rồi giảm các.
We also try to
các cái mức giá
reduce the fees and charges on public services applicable for the aviation companies that are using airports in the whole territory of Vietnam.
Rồi giảm 2% lãi suất cho vay trực tiếp.
We want to reduce 20% of the interest rates, of loans extended to SMEs.
Rồi xem xét cho
we are also considering
giãn nộp
the deferment of some taxes
cho đến ngày 31
to the 31st of December,
mà bị ảnh
and for some severely impacted products, even though they are not directly impacted by COVID, but they are suffering from indirect impact.
Và chúng tôi cũng yêu cầu là các
also requiring ministries,
các địa phương,
agencies, national governments
cắt giảm
to reduce and save their budget spendings,
50%
including the cutback of 50%
đi công tác ngoài nước
of overseas travels, and 30% of the cost of workshops and meetings and domestic travels.
Thì các cái giải pháp này thực hiện thì
if we work on all of these measures,
giá trị tương đương khoảng 7
I think that
7 tỷ đô.
We can save about 5 or 7 billion USD.
Thế thì có thể nói rằng là trong cái bối cảnh mà
so what I mean is that
tác động
in the context
với nền kinh tế
of the COVID-19
thì chúng tôi cũng
and with fiscal situation,
ngân sách Việt Nam cho năm 2020.
We are making some projection of our budget balance for this year 2020.
Dự kiến là giảm thu nếu như trong bản mà lạc quan nhất là
with the most
5,3%,
positive scenarios of the growth of 5 to 5.3%,
50.000 tỷ, tức là cỡ khoảng
our budget revenues will be reduced by 150 trillion, which is about 10%. In the worst case scenarios,
Việt Nam đồng. Còn trong đó thì trung ương sẽ giảm cỡ khoảng
the central government's budget will be cut back by 90 to 100 trillion, and the rest will be suffered by the provinces.
Còn trong trường hợp mà xấu hơn,
in worst case scenarios,
về ngân sách nó sẽ tăng lên tương ứng.
The deficits will increase accordingly.
Còn về như vậy là vừa phải giảm thu này,
so
phải tăng
we have
khả năng
lower revenues and we have higher expenditure. Seems that the deficit in Vietnam is about 5% of GDP this year.
Nếu như mà không có cái biến động gì lớn,
there's no
cái bất thường,
other unexpected changes,
sẽ thiếu hụt ở cái mức như thế.
I think that we will surely have a deficit of about 5% compared to 3.44%. So the deficit is increased by 1.5% already.
Thế thì để hỗ trợ cho để tài trợ cho cái thiếu hụt.
So to finance the budget deficits,
tổng thể,
Vietnam is embarking on different measures to finance the deficit.
Là
first,
phấn đấu là đạt
we strive to best achieve the state budget revenue target.
Có nghĩa là thu thì giảm rồi.
It means that the revenue will be decreased, but we try to improve our tax administration so as to best achieve our revenue targets.
Cái thứ hai là tập
Secondly,
nên hết cái vốn.
We will focus on increasing the disbursements of our investment plan for 2020.
Nói cái câu này thì có thể là quý vị cho rằng là nó
maybe you may think it's something unusual, but actually the situation in Vietnam is that over the recent years, disbursements for our public investment plan has been very low, about 70%.
Điều đó đồng nghĩa với lại
it means
vốn khá lớn
that we still have quite a big backlog of investment finance to be carried over from one year to the next.
Đối với năm 2020 này thì
in 2020,
vốn của chúng tôi khoảng 700.000 tỷ đồng.
We have about 700 trillion, which is about 330 3 trillion billion USD. So if you can disburse the whole amount,
chắc chắn là kinh tế Việt Nam sẽ có một cái.
I'm sure that it will stimulate the economy of Vietnam a lot.
Rồi chúng tôi dùng một cái phần.
We also use some overutilized revenues in 2019.
Đảm bảo xã hội của năm 2020,
to pay for social protection in 2020,
thu của năm 2020,
and to compensate for the revenue decline in 2020.
Và hiện nay thì
at the time being, Vietnam is negotiating with some international organizations like the IMF, World Bank, the ADB, and attempt to, obtain some low-cost finance to finance our budget deficit in 2020. Sum up, with our comprehensive measures, by now, from our perspective, the situation of Vietnam seems to be under control. We are going to be in the new normal, like before the pandemic.
Và chúng tôi cũng đang rất là mong muốn thế giới cũng sẽ có những bước đi và như đạt được như
at the global level,
cùng
countries will have
kích thích tăng trưởng kinh tế trở lại và cùng nhau phát triển.
Different measures so that we can, help each other to grow again.
Trên đây cũng là cái bài trình bày của tôi.
So that's the end of my presentation about the experience of Vietnam in the period, in the COVID period. And now I'm very willing to listen to any comments or lessons from other countries.
Chúng ta xin cảm ơn.
From other member countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tan, for a very comprehensive and thorough presentation of the Vietnam case. Let's now go to Indonesia, Pak Heru, who is the who is the head of the Subdirectorate of the Financing and Fiscal Risks in the Budget Department of the Ministry of Finance. Can you hear me? Oh.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, I see a beautiful picture on the screen.
Okay. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Let me share the screen first. Can you see the presentation? Hello?
Yes, we can see.
Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, you can see.
Thank you. Please
okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, particularly among the countries, since today we discussed the quite current issues in COVID, and hopefully can share what experience, and actually we also can hear from the experts with regard to this COVID issues. Following the discussion from previous presenters, that the number of cases in COVID-19 is increasing, although some countries is already eased, some countries is already cases quite eased, and then in addition, we still facing the increasing numbers of cases. As of from this table, as of the May 3rd, the number is confirmed cases 11,192, and the fatality rate is about 7.5, so it's a bit high, and the highest cases is in Jakarta. As of today, the data shows that there is 12,438 confirmed cases, and the died is 895, so the fatality rate is about 7.2. And currently, we see that all the provinces in Indonesia face the COVID-19. This is 34 provinces in Indonesia faces the COVID-19 cases. And as other countries, also the COVID-19 has significantly impact towards various aspects, such as cancellation of flight, both domestically and internationally, and a decreasing number of the travelers from around the globe, particularly from Chinese travelers. Purchasing Managers Index or PMI contracted, and also significant decrease in import and decreasing occupancy rate up to 50%, and also massive layoff. This is a situation that we are facing nowadays. And the negative impact of COVID-19 schools, since it deteriorates health, it reduces productivity, and as you might be aware, it will affect economic activity. In addition, COVID-19 decreased the expectation in liquidity and also in capital market toward global demand and commodity prices, as Richard presented in the beginning of our meeting, and hinder mobility of goods and people. This will translate into the commodity prices, will translate into weak economic activity, both in real and in real sector and finance. And the government of Indonesia has realized this, and therefore issued law number 1 of 2020, as Pak Rofi mentioned, that regulation is the one ingredient to have a COVID-19 mitigation policy is run smoothly. And this law is to support the real and financial sector. And this is provide a legal basis for various fiscal stimulus package to accelerate mitigation policy in terms of addressing issues on health, social, industry, and also the economic recovery. And this is actually the legal basis that I mentioned previously, that we have a law number 1 of 2020 is a legal basis for past and extraordinary measures in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. Basically, the law deals with the state financial policy or fiscal policy and financial sector policy. So this combined to this sector, the financial policy and the financial sector, fiscal and financial, and also the monetary sector. The key features of our fiscal policy with respect to the law are, among others, that we relax the budget, the deficit, the budget deficit adjustment to more than 3% up to 2022, and also adjustment of mandatory spending, except for education spending. We cannot change this because this is under our constitution. So the government maintain the 20% expenditure for education, and also provide a basis for tax incentives and facilities. And regarding the financial sector policy, the key feature, among others, are expansion of the Financial Sector Stability Committee Authority, and allowing Bank Indonesia or Central Bank to buy government bond in the primary market. And many countries have responded in mitigating the adverse impact of the pandemic and to save their economy. And it is estimated that the stimulus package reached nearly 10% of the global GDP. There is variation, however, in how much countries dispose their stimulus package. Countries like Australia, Singapore, US, Malaysia have introduced significant stimulus package for their economy, more than 10% of GDP. In terms of, among others, increasing social safety net to give tax incentive, decreasing interest rates, and quantitative easing. Indonesia has estimated to have about 2.5% of GDP for a 3 package of fiscal stimulus. And this need some updated because need some updating because as our colleague from Malaysia mentioned, that actually the stimulus is about more than about 80% of the GDP. In order to deal with this COVID-19, Indonesia has employed the optimal, try to make the optimal policy mix to address the pandemic, both from the fiscal policy and the monetary and also the financial sector policy. In terms of fiscal policy, the government has introduced budget focusing in reallocation as part of the 3 stimulus packages. Stimulus 1 is aimed to strengthen domestic economy via acceleration of spending and encourage labor-intensive sector. Stimulus 2 has introduced in order to maintain purchasing power and facilitate export and import. And the continuation of this stimulus is the latest stimulus 3 is aimed to ensure the revival of the national health and economy, as well as maintaining financial stability. And based on this fiscal, based on this current law, that the Bank Indonesia is also actively intervene the economy by, among others, lowering the 7 days reverse repo rate and lowering bank minimum reserve requirement. So this is the combination of policy mix between fiscal, monetary, and also financial sector. And regarding the banking sector, the OJK, or Financial Sector Authority, has introduced relaxation of credit for micro, small, medium enterprises and their credit restructuring. And it is realized that the government has realized that it requires extraordinary fiscal support to deal with the adverse impact of the pandemic. In health sector, the government has allocated 75 trillion rupiah that can be used to health intervention and subsidy of health insurance. The allocation also covers the incentive for central and regional medical personnel and buying medical equipment, develop health facilities and infrastructure, and human resources support. And the government also has allocated 110 trillion rupiah for social safety net. It is used to provide additional conditional cash transfer, provide grocery assistance, additional pre-employment card, exemption for electricity bill for 450 VA customers, and discount for targeted 900 VA customers. And the government also allocated industrial support in terms of other tax reserve or government bond reserve, government bond import duties, and credit subsidy for small businesses. And from the slides, we see the 4th component of fiscal stimulus is financing for supporting national economic recovery program, including for ultra micro credit and also the small medium enterprises. And it is estimated to be 150 trillion rupiah. And the fiscal and procedural incentive have also introduced to recover the declining economy back to track. For example, there is an exemption of alcohol excises for ethyl alcohol, as it is used to produce the hand sanitizer. So this is provide some regulation in order to facilitate movement of the goods and services in order to deal with the COVID-19. And it is also realized that there should be a synergy or coordination between central and local government in order to mitigate the pandemic effect toward the social economics. So there are at least 3 measures of transfer to region and period fund that were used. First is it is done by refocusing and reallocating transfers to region and period fund to support the COVID-19 recovery. This includes covers measures to refocus the general allocation funds and to refocus village fund for cash transfers. And the second, the adjustment of transfer to region and village fund allocation by Presidential Decree number 54 of 2020. This includes adjustment on revenue sharing with the local government due to lower revenue, cut the general allocation fund by 10%, and also special autonomy funds, and focus on special allocation fund for education and health, and also adjustment of health assistance funds for medical personnel incentive. And third, refocusing reallocation and adjustment on regional budget, for example, reducing personnel expenditure for remuneration, cut non-productive goods and services expenditure, and expenditure allocation for health and cash transfers. And there are also policy with regard to the regional transfers that the village cash transfer is mandated by central government to the regional government within with the maximum of 35% of village fund, with amount of is expected to distribute cash transfers 600,000 per family per month, and it covers hopefully to cover the 10 to 12 million families that reside in the village. Those are poor and did not receive additional cash transfers from central, groceries card, and pre-employment card. It is distributed once every 3 months using updated data that is validated and finalized by village discretion. And slide, this is the last slide, give us an overview of the outlook of 2020 budget due to COVID-19. On the revenue side, the economic slowdown, commodity and oil prices declining, and tax incentive have contributed toward declining revenue. And on the other hand, we see that the increasing spending on health, social safety net, and business recovery have increased the expenditure. And from these two, and also the government also provide financing for national economic recovery program, 150 trillion rupiah. And as a result, the deficit increased from, let's say, this year from 1.76% to 5.07% of GDP. And this is already, we have legal basis for this by law that before we are to less than 3% of GDP for the deficit. By that law, we now can exceed 3% threshold and up to 5.07% of GDP. This the end of my presentation, and I would like to conclude my presentation with notes that nowadays we are facing the health and humanity crisis. This condition requires extraordinary approach to deal with. We hope we can weather this condition together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Heru. I think we have come to the end of the program with the presentations, and we have a number of questions that we've received online. If I can please pose them to the speakers. There is one question that is for everyone that presented on the country cases. And it goes, could country representatives please elaborate on the challenges of negotiating policy options where relevant? This one was one of the most common challenges reported in the survey. If you recall from the survey that Ms. Ha presented, one of the common challenges that was reported was how to negotiate these policy options and how to overcome the challenges of negotiating these various policy options. Then there is one specific question for Thailand, which is interesting, given the informal sector in Thailand. The question is, can the representative from Thailand tell us how they plan to give a stimulus to the informal sector and ensure that the resources go to where they were intended, to the intended recipients? And then I know there was a question for Richard on the effect of the medium-term revenue, the effect of COVID on medium-term revenue and expenditure frameworks of underdeveloping countries. and how to prepare to overcome this matter. And I think Richard has given, I think this was from you, Pak Heru, on Indonesia. And I think Richard has given a long response online, but if he could briefly perhaps highlight a couple of the key points, that would be very useful. Let me stop. There was also one interesting question on the both for the World Bank and the IMF to share their views on the global bond situation. Since many countries are issuing recovery bonds to finance COVID-19 mitigating policy, what is the most suitable pricing policy under the circumstances? So let me stop at those questions, and then if there are further, we can continue. We've come to sort of the end, more or less, of our time, but I think we can definitely spend another maybe 10-15 minutes on questions, and then we can come to a close. Anyone from the country representatives would like to start with the challenges on negotiating policy actions? Perhaps we can start with South Korea.
On the issue of negotiating policy options, as we have elaborated on our presentations, there were intense social discussions on disaster relief money. And there were different views between ministries and different views from political parties, but the president tried to negotiate between the ministries, and the ministry also looked back what the national citizens would want for, and that's kind of how we went to negotiate policy options, like will we give the disaster relief money to all the citizens, or will we give to the under 70% income bracket? And at first, the Ministry of Economy, MOEF, was worried about the expenditure and revenue, between the balance between the revenue and expenditure. However, many of the citizens thought for this time of circumstances, it would be more appropriate to give out the relief money to all the citizens, and that's kind of how we compromised the policy option. That's for all.
Thank you very much. Anybody else would like to add from other countries? Indonesia, Vietnam?
Indonesia, can we respond?
Yes, please go ahead. You had some, important measures that you took in terms of changing the fiscal rules and a number of other measures. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you. It's actually something that we cannot ignore the political support for this one, and then therefore we also have some negotiation, and we done this, and also because the law actually first should be agreed by the parliament, and then it should by the president first, and then negotiation afterwards. And the latest discussion seems quite supportive, that the parliament understand on us, so they support. But hopefully it is goes through the parliament, and we have the policy there, legal basis there, and then this can use we can disperse all the policies. Yes, and the policy option also, I think we need to also closely coordinate with the authority of the monetary, and this is the bank central, and also for the financial sector. And in the Indonesian case, all this comes into one law in number 1/2020. This encompasses all these sectors, the fiscal policy and also monetary, and then also the financial sectors, as well as also for the retail sector. I think this is something that that as a nation, I think we feel the same feeling that we are in a quite extraordinary situation, and we also we all realize that this need, like Richard mentioned, unorthodox approach to deal with this, and I think we should share the same the common sense that we are in a crisis, and also the coordination with Myanmar. This is actually this policy action. I think the fiscal authority cannot go by itself. Also facilitate with the from monetary and also from financial, as well as the support from the parliament. I think this is an ingredient that we need in order to deal with this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pahiro. Any other country representative would like to come in on that question of challenges? Yes, please. Go ahead.
Việt Nam muốn có một chút bổ sung ở cái.
In Vietnam, we would like to add some points.
Các cái bộ ngành ở Việt Nam thì có thể nói rằng là khi mà đàm phán về
Ministries of Vietnam, when you negotiate the support packages, especially for the citizens,
làm việc cũng phải nói là rất là nhiều lần.
We had to hold a number of meetings for that.
Đứng trên quan điểm của từng ngành,
from the perspective of each ministries,
nhưng mà
all of them have their own reasons.
Chúng tôi chia làm hai nhóm.
In general, we have two
công việc thuộc thẩm quyền của chính phủ.
Groups of tasks. One belong to the government. The government can, issue documents easily and can implement activities immediately. And for the things that need to secure the approval of the Parliament, we have to go through formal channels for the National Assembly to, give the green light.
Chúng tôi có cái đặc thù riêng là chúng tôi chỉ có một
The special situation in Vietnam is that we just have one party. So the politics in Vietnam seems to be simpler than the other countries.
Cũng có thể nói là vì thế mà cái tiến trình
and that's why
Việt Nam cũng khá là nhanh.
The process of policy making in Vietnam seems to be quite prompt.
Cái quá trình thực hiện cũng rất là khẩn trương.
And we can implement policies very quickly.
Ở đây trong quá trình thương thảo thì tôi
So during the negotiation, I would like to share an experience of Vietnam relating to the credit policies.
Ra phương án ấy, thì bộ
when we propose policies
chung cho tất cả các doanh nghiệp,
the Malaysia would like to support all the businesses impacted by COVID, including the enterprises that were dissolved. We can allow them to borrow from the banks with zero interest rate.
Người ta có tiền lương để trả cho,
so that they can pay their employees. We strongly oppose the idea because those enterprises that were dissolved, we not place any collaterals and they not to pay the loan. So that's the policies, and when we discuss, this is just an example to illustrate that policy choices are quite controversial, and we had a lot of discussion. I heard a point from the other members that we can have easing regulations. But I just would like to say that whatever we need to be safe, we need to be prudent. Even in very complicated cases like this, we need to support the people early, but we need to be prudent, be safe in financial management, so that we do not have any consequences and to avoid any abuses of policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting indeed. Can we go to Thailand? Ms. Lekyananda? For the question? Yes, please, go ahead.
For the question that how does Thailand plan to help the informal workers, right? So I need to elaborate on the cash handout, the 5,000 baht cash handout per month that I said before. So actually, this cash handout measure will be mainly target the informal workers anyway, because to receive this money, the individual applied for it needs to be out of the social security system. So anyone within the social security system would not get this the 5,000 baht. There will be the money from the social security fund, which is different money. And also the people who receive the money is not in government, not a government employee. I'm not so sure, but any employees under the government office. And we check this by using the national ID. And we have the additional fund for people in the agricultural sector also. Is that clear or?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so is this answer the question?
I believe so, at least on my side. The question was asked by one of the participants, but if there is a need for further clarification, of course, they'll come back. Thank you very much. Then maybe I can go to Richard and Holger if they would like to tackle the questions sent for the World Bank and the IMF.
Okay, thank you, Alma. I'll just briefly summarize the question from our colleagues in Laos about the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on medium-term revenue and expenditure frameworks. I sent a longer narrative answer, but I think that the short answer is well, there's certainly an awful lot of uncertainty. We don't really know yet the depth of the crisis and the pace at which a recovery will come. But as I mentioned in the presentation, it's really important to think about the longer-term implications of any tax and expenditure measures that are taken now, as often they can be very hard to roll back. So it's important to be time-bound, as targeted as possible, and as transparent and specific. That said, if, as probably seems likely, we see a relatively slow pace of recovery, then there'll need to be continued, perhaps, tax and expenditure measures, less about crisis response and more about facilitating a recovery. That could be particularly continued protection of incomes among vulnerable households, SMEs, and the informal sector, and considering ways to perhaps stimulate demand in the more traditional sense, particularly if we see a slow pace of recovery in export demand. Finally, don't forget that many of the structural reforms that countries were already pursuing around digitalization, automation of revenue collection, both tax and customs, will be even more important now in a social distancing world, and particularly measures as well to think about ways to more effectively tax the digital economy, particularly with the accelerated growth of e-commerce, given the changes that we're expecting in a post-COVID world. And finally, perhaps in terms of medium-term planning, think about different scenarios. So a sort of accelerated pace of recovery or a slower pace of recovery requiring extended fiscal measures and what that might do in terms of medium-term planning. And maybe I'll leave the bonds question to Holger. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Holger?
Yeah. Am I on?
Yes, you're on. Go ahead.
Yeah, on the bond question, look, of course, countries are facing market pressures both domestically and internationally. And on the pricing of bonds, I think countries have it's a bit of a wishy-washy answer, but they have to be more flexible, but not not scare the markets, right? We have seen some countries which have accepted no increase of interest rates on their bond issuance whatsoever and have continued with very long-term maturities. And so we think that some flexibility, both in pricing and in maturity conditions and so on, is warranted under the present circumstances, but not too much. You don't want to signal that you're scared, right? But you do want to have some flexibility to accommodate market circumstances. And we do signal in some countries, we do see in some countries perhaps a lack of flexibility in addressing market circumstances. That's the short answer on the pricing question. The other issue I just wanted to raise, we feel that a lot of the spending packages are still, the costing is still preliminary, and I would really encourage the country participants and the ministries of finance to keep re-estimating the components of the spending packages. The spending packages, to our mind, are in many cases ceilings or envelopes, and it is important for ministries of finance to regularly update these estimates, because we think there are large uncertainties in the uptake of programs, in the impact of revenue measures taken, and so on. So our advice is to regularly update these estimates. What we're also signaling to countries is that they have to start estimating the impact of what I call automatic stabilizers. So the impact of a lower growth rate on both normal expenditure programs and on normal revenue policies, and perhaps do that, as Richard says, on a scenario basis. But there has to be also an estimate not only of the new COVID package, but also of the impact on the deficit of the expected slowdown. And nobody knows how much this slowdown will be, but I think it will be important for countries and for ministries of finance to develop scenarios of, medium case and worst case and, beneficial case and so on. So I think for budget departments and fiscal policy offices, it will be a very busy time in the coming months. Okay.
Thank you very much. Was there, I think you might want to mute, Holger, there's probably some echo coming from. Was Mr. Suhas wanted to come with a question? I know you came up to the screen a couple of times. If
yes, I had a supplementary question to Thailand. I mean, basically, it's a question not just for Thailand, but for and many countries around the region. The question is, how do you, in Thailand, of course, it's easy. They're basing it on the national ID card. But in many countries, the informal sector is actually far larger than the formal sector. And in some cases, people the question of identification came up. And the question was, and some people suggested that, for instance, workers in restaurants, we could give the money on to the owner of the restaurant who could then pass it on. Now, the problem with that sort of solution is that how do you make sure that the restaurant owner is not giving his or her employees a haircut before they pass on the money? So two questions, basically. One is, how do you really identify people when there are a number of migrant laborers or people who have come informally from some other remote part of the country to work in a major city? And then how do you make sure that a transfer takes place? What are the modalities? People may not have a bank account, so is it a possibility to give money as they do in Africa and other places through the mobile network? What are the solutions people are thinking of?
Thank you. Great question. Does anybody want to come in with a response to that? From the panel or from the bank, the fund?
Can I have answer, Alma?
Yes, please. Go
yes,
ahead.
I think it's the situation is same with the Indonesian problem right now, because Indonesia is a big country. There's around 270 million people in there, and the problem is about the database. I agree about that. We don't know exactly the people by name and by address. We just have our database only cover the 40% of people in below decile 1 until decile 4, by name, by address, even though there are still many inclusion and exclusion error. But right now, we want to escalate the social safety net more than 40% of our population. The problem is who is there, who these people is. So we try to merge the data from everywhere. Something like we have a database from the electricity household that already cover more than 90% of our population, and using the we call it Gojek or the Tokopedia, that they have a record for people that using the online system, and many data that we try to merge to keep. But I agree that some of the program, especially in the social safety net, become overlapping. It means that maybe when people get more than two or three cash, two or three program. Like we have a program, like Heru mentioned, we have a program for household, program for subsidy and everything. But maybe some people didn't get anything. But luckily in Indonesia, we are more try to be more what is called. We try to help each other near us. So we help each other in the neighbor to make sure that everybody, the thing is to get food. This is important. So we share between us. This is an important thing in this situation and condition. I think it's from me, Alma. But I think one thing, this is a good experience for us. In the long run, we need to have a good database for everybody. This is our learn. So this is like a joke. In the bad condition, we always have a good policy. Thank you.
You're getting to do the digitalization of the whole government, Pak Kunta. So that's a good thing to do in the future.
And let's not waste the crisis.
Yes, indeed. Thanks a lot. Anybody else with any final question before we try to close? We are obviously over time, and I hope that we have extended. I know that we were probably going to be cut off at 1, but it seems like our colleagues have extended maybe for a few minutes so that we're not cut off abruptly. So perhaps if there are no further questions, let me just take the opportunity to, I will certainly not intend to summarize the rich discussions and presentations that were here today, but I just want to take the opportunity to say thank you, first of all, to Pak Kunta and Mr. Han for leading and actually pushing for the organization of this event. And I hope it is the first in a series, and we will hope to probably continue the discussion maybe with specific topics and other topics of interest for this community and others as well in the region. So many thanks to them for taking the initiative and making that possible. Secondly, I really would like to thank the Secretariat, the PEMNA Secretariat, Ms. Ha and her team. I think they have really, within a very short period of time, they really brought this event together. Very important under the circumstances. So many thanks to them. And of course, to my team in the World Bank, Bernard and colleagues. Many thanks also for, and Richard, of course, for participating, our colleagues from the IMF, for putting together the presentations and responding quickly to the event. So many thanks to everyone. I would like to give the floor to the Secretariat, who would like to say something about, I think, the event evaluation. So over to you, unless Pakunta or Mr. Han, I don't know if Mr. Han is online, if you would like to say a couple of words in closing.
On behalf of co-chair Mr. Han, thank you very much. With this case, with this event, we were assured that we are doing the right thing. We learned a lot today, and I hope every country will overcome the crisis, and looking forward to seeing you in person soon in the late this year. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Pakunta, would you like to say something? Or?
Yes, thank you for everybody. This is a very fruitful discussion today. Even though this is our first webinar, I hope the webinar is very successful. So this has become new norm for us. Yeah, maybe the secretariat will arrange another webinar. It's better we have a webinar than I think. Because this is a very successful webinar, I think. And I very happy because we have already shared our policy and our stimulus that we want to cover with the pandemics. I think most of the country have the same policy or the same policies, the same stimulus. And I agree that after this, we already prepare everything. We need still some emergency exit if the assumption that we are already birth is broken or the pandemic COVID will longer than we expected. So because this is still large uncertainty in this condition. And it's better we not only thinking about 2020, but also what happened in the next year or 2021 or until the 2022 soon. This is from my last word, and we hope and we will pray that the pandemic COVID-19 will be over soon. And thank you and keep in touch.
Thank you very much, Pakunta. Indeed, we all hope that this will be over soon, and we can obviously meet in person and come to Jakarta next time and do the next event. So thanks everybody. Over to the Secretariat.
Okay, so the Secretariat prepared the post-event evaluation survey. So we'll send the link and QR code for the survey after this webinar. So please complete the survey within this week. It won't take a lot. It's just a few minutes. So please complete it. And in addition, if you'd like to download the presentation materials of the webinar, please download it on our PEMNA webpage. That's it for our side. Thank you. Thank you for your participation, and thank you, Arma.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody. Have a good night, whoever is in Washington, and a good day for all of you, the rest of the world. Thank you. Bye-bye.